What's up, amigos? Commander Jaime here today. Today we're going to do a Regalia premium deck profile. This is the deck I actually prepped for Spring Fest, but ultimately took Davos, but I put some time, effort into it, and even added some different win cons that we usually don't see as well, and I'll explain the mindset behind it as well, the card choices, and even show some key plays that will help you definitely. So let's get right into it. I'm also a METAFY coach that has helped numerous players get their results in tops. I actually help with the standard, V premium, and premium formats, and I help you prepare for tournament preparation as well, so that way you get your results that you're looking for and helping out with your goal. I just want to help the community grow, and feel free to book a session with me. And also to help you out more, I also just came out with the book How to Win Cardfight Tournaments, Break Through Your Mental Barrier, and Topping Trading Card Game Tournaments. And so it's available for Kindle, paperback, and also the audiobook will be coming out soon, and it's the #1 new release as well. So I'm excited for you guys to see the content and value from it too and your results. So right off the back with the mindset, one of the things that with this metagame we have the write down decks. This is June of 2023, so this is before History Collection, just to preface that as well. And we also have Team League, so that also introduces different types of decks being played by different players, such as rogue decks. One deck in particular that I was considering that would show up would be Mega Colony. You know, you got cards like the Gredora Stride that would deny you Superior Calling outside of from hand, and then also cards like Brilliant Blister that could rest your stuff like Rearguards, for example. So it's just like, with those things in mind, you know, Regalia was a solid choice because with the write down decks, you have Marduk. So if you ride up to grade 3, you still have a solid restanding Vanguard turn, but also you can add to it a Stride, so you have 5 drive checks in total. And you can have a lot of aggression because you're going to use the Force 2 marker on the Vanguard as well. So a very solid play. And then going into your Stride turns, you're going to rely into the Minerva Stride. So essentially you can Soul Blast 3 to get an extra drive, but when you pair it with the Norn, you essentially attack with 4 drives, restand, lose 1 drive check, and then you go for triple drive. So you see 7 drive checks, which is very powerful. We run a decent amount of crit, so there's that pressure too on top of the Force 2 marker. So Minerva is usually our go-to play still, even in the Stride turns as well. And you got the GB3 that can also restand not only itself once more, but also have a full restanding board of Regalia units too on top of that. So the last thing that you may have noticed, especially from the thumbnail, it is Ultima. And so the reason this is very unique for those don't know, there is a choice restriction between Ultima and the Over Trigger. You cannot use both in the same deck for the very reason that, one, it can actually stack an Over Trigger with its skills. So on place, when you Ultimate Strike, Counterblast 2, search your deck for 4 cards, call 2, and then put the rest onto the top of the deck in any order. So as you can see, you can get some combo pieces to work with on the field, but also stack your deck with 2 cards. And that essentially can be 2 crits. That could be a crit and a stand trigger, so you can get also more attacks that way. And essentially, you're guaranteed those triggers to pop off. But not only that, it has the other skill where essentially that all of your units get the triggers effects. So for example, if you drove check a crit trigger, all of your units get an additional critical and then the power from it as well. So essentially, your columns become really beefy pretty easily because you're drive checking 2 triggers. So your columns are going to see plus 20 at a maximum with like the powerful triggers like the 10k power ups. There are changes that I made in the main deck to make this a little more consistent too, but not only that, there are cards that also I might want to search against a certain matchup to guarantee a turn. What's really scary about Ultima as well is because you have a Regalia Heart, you can actually restand Ultima with Norn and then do Twin Drive. So you get to see more drive checks on top of that. So if you see even more triggers, the more powerful your turn goes. And obviously, because you're stacking criticals, you're at least going to be crit 3, if not crit 4, guaranteed on the Vanguard swing. And then if you're restanding, that's another 3 to 4 crit to the face with a massive power up. And then of course, your rearguard columns are also lethal. They're going to be crit 2, crit 3, or even crit 4 if you mixed another Force 2 marker as well on those columns too. 2 more interactions before we go into the card choices. One is that you can actually go into Marduk first, and if you're going first, assuming right, and that'll enable GB1. And so then when it goes to your turn, you're going to G-Guard with Laura, and Laura was a GB1 G-Guard flip. So by the time it goes to your turn again, you'll be GB3, and so that's when you can actually do Ultimate Strike. You need to be essentially 3 cards face up in the G zone to do so, and you can end games like that. So a lot of people don't expect Ultima because most decks, if not 9 times out of 10, are playing in some type of over trigger. It could be the Catter one, it could be the Cray Elemental one, but essentially they're not expecting that. And this can be the win con that can actually seal the deal and search for the combo pieces that you may not have. So for example, if you need copies of Idriso, or maybe some type of resist, enablement, or combo piece, there are cards that you can search specifically from the main deck and make your turn work, but also still have a very powerful turn if you couldn't do a regular Minerva turn, but you had the resources to actually do this as well. The last thing is with the Mega Colony matchup, there comes a point, there's also cards in the main deck that help get around the grade 4 Gredora as well. But with Ultima, because you cannot superior call the cards from the deck, so because of the wording, then essentially put the rest of the cards in any order on top of the deck becomes 4 cards stacked in any order. So you may not be able to call stuff from deck, but because of that, you're able to stack 4 cards now on top of your decks, and you get to benefit from all of your units getting those trigger effects. So you can go triple crit if you want. You can go with the stand trigger if they stun your field. You may have read it and then did the ultimate strike, but now you have a rested rearguard field still. You can use the Dreaming Dragon, because we do play it, to restand your field that way, so you can still take advantage of that. It's another way to kind of get around that, like that skill in particular, because it's kind of annoying. And it can be a powerhouse turn. In fact, especially if they invest into that prior turn to shut you down. So onto the grade 3s, we are playing 4 Angelica. I used to play 3 copies of Angelica too, because it's one of those things that I was trying to minimize. Because when you have too many grade 3s in a deck that Genesis ultimately doesn't draw a lot of cards, your only saving grace is really Minerva, where it can generate a lot of advantage because of the drive checks that it can do. But outside of that, Genesis is kind of like you can call stuff and get some stuff back, but it doesn't really generate a lot of advantage. So just having like that cards like grade 3s excess that you don't need was problematic. But we are playing Ultima now, so I felt more confident, more comfortable playing the 4th copy at this point. And you may be asking, why not play Freg? So the difference between Freg and Angelica is really a counterblast. When you realize when you're trying to go to your grade 3 turn, especially if you're going first, you need a counterblast for Marduk, and you need a counterblast for Idrisol if you don't have the Norn, and also if you're trying to put the Divine Gauge under the Norn as well. So you need 2 counterblasts maximum at that point to really go full out. You can get away with maybe 1 counterblast and then use the countercharger as well, but to make it a lot easier, why use a card like Freg to take up that counterblast essentially? In fact, I've had opponents that damage deny in certain moments that, like, you know, I'm not gonna take that Marduk, or I'm not gonna take a restanding Vanguard, so I'm gonna damage deny, hit something else if I call something and it's on the field. I've played that interaction too, so it's just like Angelica is so much better because you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to commit about like a counterblast to the Vanguard before Marduk. And not only that, but you're on attack, you can give units 2 Divine Gauges, 1 of each, right? And so that gives you an opportunity to give the Norm behind Vanguard a 2nd Divine Gauge. And that's very important because once you use the first one, it's gone. And when you let there be their turn, if they have any retire power, they can get rid of the Norm if it doesn't have a Divine Gauge. But you equip it with the 2nd one, so it still has 1, so it's protected. Not only that, it sets it up for the next turn too, so that way you don't have to worry about fetching or making a Divine Gauge for a Norn. It already has 1, so then you can just focus on the rest of your turn to do whatever you want, whether it be Minerva or even Ultima as well. And going into Idrisol, we still want to play 4 copies. This is what we literally use: counterblast, fetch Norn from the deck, and then put up to 2 rearguards with a Divine Gauge each. So you could choose 0 or 2 or 1. Ideally, you're gonna call the Norn, give it a Divine Gauge for sure. And this is also writable as Vanguard too. And if you're playing 4/4, then you have maximum copies of the grade 3 to ultimate stride as well. And then lastly, we are having the grade 3 heals, and so it's important to use these to survive still. The Regalia heals, I feel like you don't need right now, especially with prior history collection. So they're not even a rot at this point, but essentially with grade 3 heals you can survive. You could also like pay the cost of stride too, because you're going to call Idrisil as a rearguard anyway, and then you'll want to have your copies of Angelica in your hand for ultimate stride, so you have some flexibility there. Onto the grade 2s, I'll cover the basics first. Obviously, 4 copies of Norn, this is part of the Regalia engine. You need this to restand your Vanguards or rearguards that have Regalia in the name. It's also very advantageous where you can use the skill to counterblast, draw a card, and then give something a Divine Gauge, and then soul charge too. So that's just a really good skill. You may not use it as much. It's a list of priority things. You want to make sure you can do your Vanguard skill and then Idrisil if needed. And then if you have any extra counterblast, you can use cards like Norn, for example. So it helps generate advantage, and it helps you just set up for your restanding Vanguard column and your rearguard column. So it's super important, and it's a Regalia. The next Regalia that we do play is 4 copies of Norn, and we are not playing the other card, Lugisa. I think that's how you pronounce it. So a couple reasons with this deck. You want to be as fluid as possible. You also want to be able to call cards in the early game that can also return advantage, but also do some damage to your opponent. You want to get them to a 2 to 3 damage sweet spot. So when you do Marduk, that turn is a lot more lethal than it is before. And so they have to have some kind of like Sentinel or some kind of grade 3 heal to even survive that turn at that point too. So that grade 2 Lugisa doesn't help because it also uses a counterblast. So it's the same dilemma with like Frag, for example, especially if if that's the only counterblast you have and then you leave a rearguard in the front row, they're gonna attack the rearguard and then just pass turn, and then you're like, I have nothing for your grade 3 turn. So, and it's random too because it's like the top 5, and it's not always the card that you need necessarily. You can call a trigger sometimes, and it's like, was the counterblast really worth it at that point? More than likely it wasn't. Obviously, if you get the nuts, then you get the nuts at that point, right? But that's where Norn or Thrud comes into play because she's free. You know, you can call it, give it a divine gauge, and then after it attacks, you can go into Soul and draw you a card, and then move a divine gauge. This is important because this is another way to also give you a Norn to have a divine gauge without using a counterblast. If your opponent is limiting your counterblast as well, they can make it so where you cannot use a counterblast to give a divine gauge for a Norn to make your turn more aggressive. So you have an option, an opportunity with a card like Norn that can attack first, go into Saw and move the divine gauge to the Norn that you want to use that turn. So super important. It's free. It has a Regalia name too on top of that, so why not use it at that point? So that's why I decided to use more copies, because it also draws you a card. This is a card that you can call in turn 2 that lets you dig deeper into your deck too. So yeah, more consistency of seeing your Angelicas, your Idrissils, and other combo pieces that you're looking forward to. Now to the spicy text. You may have seen this card already in my prior deck profiles with Fenrir, Himiko, and then also other phenomenal players like Astro Susanoo. This card is really a consistency boost. This is literally like a Greed Shade in Genesis, and me playing Grand Blue, I highly appreciate this card for what it does to Genesis. And so it's a simple fact where on place on rearguard, Soul Blast 1, discard a card, grab a clan card that matches your Vanguard, and add it to your hand. So essentially, because we're playing Genesis, we're going to grab Genesis cards. This means your grade 3s such as Angelica, your Idrissils. This means your grade 2s like Norn, or your other combo pieces like Frud. This could be even defensive quality, such as your grade 3 heals or your PG draws that are Genesis as well. One note that also let me not play the Overtrigger as much too is that it cannot get like other Keter cards. So you can't grab another copy of itself. You cannot grab a copy of an Overtrigger or some other Keter Sanctuary cards that you may play in the deck. So that's out of the table essentially. So be mindful of that. But the thing is, it doesn't use a counterblast. I actually played Gleipnir before to have a similar reason where you can start fetching cards from Soul and adding them to your hand. This lets you add cards from your Soul because you do Soul Blast, but also the entire drop zone. Like, that is amazing. When you think about it, most of the time, if your opponent can get rid of your Idrissils or your Norns on the field and there's no way for you to get those back or draw into them, you can use a card like this to actually fetch those cards back from the drop zone and reuse them that next turn. That makes your turns like live more consistently without having to worry about losing your pieces during their battle phase essentially. So it's just phenomenal card with consistency. And also when it comes to like Ultimate Stride, this is another way to get another copy of the Vanguard if you pretty much have a surplus of the other cards that you need. Sometimes this card, I use it to prep ahead. You can get the grade 3 heals to defensively live against certain matchups too, or you can also get combo pieces that you can work with in the moment too. Like even in early turns, like grade 2 turn, you can get like a Thrud, for example. If you soul charge it with another card, sometimes you can get cards that you rode with that ultimately you wanted as rigor. So for example, I run the Soul Blast Reducer as a grade 1, but there are times that you have to ride it because it's the only grade 1 that you have. But then when you get to your grade 3 turn, you can use a card like this to fetch it out, and now you reduce your Soul Blast by 3, and Marduk becomes a lot more easier to do as well moving on. So it's a phenomenal card overall, and I do play cards like Dreaming Dragon too, where it's a lot easier to do those cards and actually use them too. So if they do get soul charge or they get damage and they end up in the drop zone, or you have to guard with them, like you have access to those cards still, which is phenomenal. The last of the grade 2s is 2 copies of Arthun, and so some of you may have never seen this card, some of you may have seen this card in my Himiko deck profile. So this is resist in a different way. So essentially, it has to be in the front row rearguard circle to activate its ability continuously. All of your rearguards with different card names than this card cannot be chosen by your card's effects, your opponent's card effects. So essentially, you give resist to the rest of your board, which means that protects your Idrisos, that protects your Norns behind the Vanguard and rearguard columns as well. So it's really nice because at that point, if you're going against a clan that has a disruptive play and you know they have the card, you can still play around it. The only way that they get around it is that they have a certain play that gets around it, that maybe targets or doesn't target, or they have two ways to disrupt you in the same turn. And so it's a lot easier if they only have one at that point, because, for example, Mega Colony uses Brilliant Blister, right? As soon as your Vanguard attacks, they can use it, rest your other rearguard column, and then that shuts down that column on top of like guarding your Vanguard at that point. But with a card like Arthur, they cannot choose the other column. They would have to choose this guy, and honestly, it's the weakest column that you have. In fact, you could just call this by itself, just for that very reason, so you can focus on your other two columns if you want to. This also helps against like a Grand Blue matchup with Cannoneer. Cannoneer will pop your Norn behind the Vanguard, which could disrupt your turn on restanding the Minerva. So you may have like a quad check Vanguard, but if they pop your Norn, then that's all it does. It doesn't restand and you lose advantage because you're not doing a triple drive and stuff like that. So this protects even against like Cannoneer as well. And the last thing that I want to say about this card is that I'm only playing 2 copies because I don't want to see it a lot, because it can be cloggy in a sense, because it doesn't really do much outside of that too. But what's really cool is because now that we're playing Ultima, this is a card that you can search on top of your Idriso. Not only you set up your restaining turn, but you have this card that also protects your Idriso and your Norn behind the Vanguard as well. So you can guarantee an Ultima turn to go through a disruptive play that you can actually stop with this guy. Onto the grade 1s, we are playing 4 copies of Mikadahime. This is a solid card that I continuously use because it's Soul Blast 3 for the next time you Soul Blast. So this helps Minerva becoming Soul Blast 0 Regalias. This becomes Marduk Counterblast Soul Blast 3, or if you have 2, they can stack. So Marduk can be Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 0. So this helps with every single stride that you have that costs a Soul Blast. So it's just useful overall. It also alleviates the pressure of having enough cards in the Soul, especially Regalia cards, so you don't have to like Soul Charge too much aggressively, which could get you closer to deck out. So this helps a lot. And if you're not, since we're not playing the Veritrum too, we don't have to worry about having enough Soul for the Veritrum on top of that as well. We are playing 3 copies of VAR. So VAR is one of the best grade 1s for Regalia too. There are some things I had to make room to just squeeze it down to 3, but ideally I would play 4 as well. But when it attacks or boosts, you can give it a Divine Gauge essentially. But the other skill is very important because you can discard the Divine Gauge from it, and then you can Soul Charge 3. That's a generic Soul Charge, but then if you have Regalia in the name, you can retire the unit and then counter charge as well. So then this is your Soul Charging and also counter charging engine by itself. Like I said, since I'm playing 4 Mikadahime, that reduces the Soul Blast load that you need, so you don't have to Soul Charge as aggressively. But this is a nice addition that you can use. And then if you end up with 1 Counterblast on your grade 3 turn, this can let you use, essentially you do Idriso, search for the Norn, set that up, and then if you have the Divine Gauge added with this card because it was on the field, then you can counter charge and Soul Charge and now reuse that same Counterblast for Marduk. And so that becomes a lot more live. And also moving forward, if you're using Armaruda, it's another way to get to closer to the Soul Blast 15. Obviously, the other card helps reduce it to like Soul Blast 12, Soul Blast 9. But with Soul Charging additional cards, you can get to whatever you're trying to do. I am playing 2 copies of Apple Witch Cider. So I really like this card because it's very generic in Genesis and you can kind of splash it in any deck. But one of the reasons that I really do like this card is another way to Soul Charge, but selectively in a way where you can Soul Charge 1 and bounce this card back to your hand so you get the card back and at the same time you Soul Charge 1. Or if you left it on the field, you can Soul Charge 2. So then that lets you aggressively add another card into the Soul, so that way over time you have a good amount of Soul by the time you're grade 3 as well. The other skill that may come up too, it may not come up as much, but it could come up, is that when you guard with this card, you can put a card from your hand into your Soul, and then for every 3 cards in your Soul, it gets an additional 5k. So this can become a card that has a lot of shield. So essentially, if you have extra grade 3s that you really don't need, like a bunch of Angelicas, for example, you can shove that into Soul, and now you're getting more shield value from that. or maybe you just need a Regalia name, so you can set up for the following turn, and you're maybe short by 1, and so you can shove a Regalia from hand at that point, so that way you're pretty much good on your turn coming back at that point. This is also a card that you can call alongside with Flood, for example, and both cards will actually just remove themselves from the field, and then also just like return that advantage back in some form or shape at that point. So it's really nice to be able to throw down these cards early on, be able to fight off aggressiveness, and also be aggressive at the same time, so you're good on your next turn. We are playing 1 copy of Skull, 1 copy of Expo, and then 1 of Sanctitude. So this is, I guess, what was left to fit in the text, you can call it that. Essentially, one with the Sentinel, the Sanctitude is like even more so important because Genesis doesn't have a lot of a hand advantage, so I highly consider this card because it usually is a 1 card PG essentially, especially if your opponent's going to do some type of triple drive. Usually strides, obviously moving forward, that's super helpful. Then you have cards like Expo as well that are Regalia. Now what's really cool about Expo is that it can return any 3 normal units with different names with Regalia and bottom deck them. And then of course you get additional effects where essentially if you have a Regalia in the name as Vanguard, this gets an additional plus 3k, and then if you have a face up card that has Regalia in your G zone, this lets you draw a card too, so you can get some advantage back. This becomes a 10k booster, but it's a Regalia unit, but it also recycles your Norns, your Idrisos, your Frudds, your Vars, and your Angelicas if needed to. So whatever combination of cards you need back into the deck, you can do so. This actually is a different way of Dreaming Dragon, because Dreaming Dragon activates at the end of turn and returns everything back. That's phenomenal. But this card is during your main phase. So if you literally need a Norn and you don't have any left in deck from an Idriso search, then you can return Norns this way, then use Idriso to grab those Norns, and then reshuffle your deck at that point too. So you can at least set up for your turn as well, so it can come up. And if you return 3 cards, it's almost like equivalent to a triple drive at that point, so it saves you almost like a turn at that point, excluding like, you know, any like drawing effects and stuff like that. The Skull is there for consistency. I actually was playing 2 before just to make sure that you can get Idriso easily, your Vanguard, Angelica, your grade 3 heals, but I had to make room for the 4th Angelica, so I ultimately just took out the 2nd Skull and just played 1. It can be a 13k booster, 13k attacker, since you soul blasted at that point too, so it could be used that way, but it's more there for the consistency reasons. Onto the grade 0/ remaining triggers, we have the starter, V starter. You just want to make sure you get their ticket shield. With the critical triggers, we are playing 8 crits, 4 of them being the Stride Fighter crit. So again, you want to save your Angelicas for Ultimate Stride, you want to call your Idrisos, so this helps a lot too. And also 4 copies of the Catter Sanctuary crit trigger. So there might be times where you are literally short by 1 soul on your grade 3 turn, and so you technically do not have GB live, so your other soul charging crits do not activate, and then of course you're not Fenrir, so you can use the Fenrir crits. So the Catter Sanctuary card is a way that you can boost a rearguard first and then go into soul in the same turn that you're trying to do Marduk, so that's super helpful. And then it's also still 15k shield and 10k power up, so that's nice. The 2k power up doesn't really come up as much. If you have an 8k booster, you can make it into a 10k booster at that point. And then of course just line up with like a grade 3 like Idriso, for example, so that way at that point that could make a number if you have a column like that. The last triggers that I have are 3 copies of the PG draw and 1 Dreaming Dragon. So because we are playing Ultima, we don't need the over trigger in our trigger lineup at that point, so we can make room for other cards. One of the reasons that I wanted to play PG draws over the Jotun Regalia grade 1 PG is because Genesis again needs to have draw power. Defensively as well, it's really nice just to have a draw go into damage and get you a card back against those ride down decks too early on, because sometimes they are really aggressive on turn 2 on top of that, like Steam Maidens for example. And then also like during your drive checks, it's also nice to see a draw PG, because most of the time they're either going to take the Vanguard, which is already going to do enough damage, or 2, they're going to perfect guard it. Most of the time they're going to perfect guard it because they want to survive, right? So then if you get a draw trigger, you get an additional card to work with for the next turn, and it's a perfect guard at that point too. And then this also leaves room for Dreaming Dragon, because we're not playing the OT. This is another way to recycle your deck at the end of the turn. GB1, this goes back to your deck and shuffle your entire drop zone. If you shuffle 10 or more cards from your drop zone, you get to draw 1 card, so you get advantage back. This is a card you can grab with the grade 2 that Dirung, I think that's how you pronounce it. It's like the green shade. So it's a lot easier to grab this card if you do soul charge it, or it ends up into the drop zone. Super phenomenal card. And because we're playing the draw PGs, this leaves a little more room in the grade 1, so that's why I'm able to play a lot of different grade 1s now. And also make some room for like the grade 2 space, because I did increase the grade 2 count as well. Now into the G zone. So we are playing 4 copies of Minerva, so you definitely want to max out this card. Again, Soul Blast 3 Regalias get an extra drive check. Soul Blast 6 GB3 Regalias, you can actually restand your full board after it attacks, and it loses 3 drive checks too. So you can actually have 3 Vanguard attacks. I will be straightforward that I usually don't go for that play. It's more like if I can, then it's a bonus at that point. I really do focus just making sure that I'm able to at least get the additional drive check, do quad check, then do triple drive, and then be able to maximize that turn from that way. And then if I can use different strides the following turn, then that works out. So I'm not as aggressive with like more Regalia cards, and I'm also at the same time like not as aggressive like soul charging a bunch of cards that hopefully meet that 9 Regalia requirement total essentially too. So I want to just FYI for people that way too. But it's very powerful already when you do the quad check and then you do the triple drive. That itself does a lot, especially since you're swinging 48 minimum. So that does a lot more than you would think. You have 2 copies of Marduk, so I still play 2 copies of this card because one, if you go first, you get to use one, and then you have the second one just in case. Certain matchups where if you don't have the Arthun to resist your board, it may be good to continually go into Marduk because you have a card like Angelica that protects your board as long as it's face up at that point. So you can get a restand in because Angelica is protecting those cards with Divine Gauges, and then when you do your restand, then you can do Marduk because at that point you really don't care. So it makes your turn somewhat aggressive at that point too, moving forward. And then of course we're playing a copy of Amaruta. Amaruta Revelation, sometimes that helps with soul charging or even just knowing the top card. Sometimes with the second skill with the act, the counterblast to give you a regard crit and 10k, you draw 2 cards and soul charge 5 if you have 4 less in the soul too. So you can like see what's on top of the deck at that point. And at that point it might be an Idrisil, so you can leave it and then draw 2 cards and then you're in the promised land. that might make your turn actually, because other than that you would 9 times out of 10 go into Minerva at that point too. Then we also play 1 copy of the Regalia Muspel. So this is if they do damage deny you, where essentially you still need to activate an Idrisil skill. So this, when you stride it, you can Soul Blast at least 3 and you can either countercharge or you can draw a card. You can do one or the other, not both. But you can countercharge, and then that way you can use Idrisil, and now you have a restanding Vanguard that goes triple drive and then goes twin drive. So your turn is still good. This is probably one of the best scenarios where a clan, if they get damage denied, they have a subpar stride that's free. But this literally makes it so that you're still restanding. So I think that's really cool when it comes to this clan. We also have 1 copy of Jack Dagna. So this is where essentially if they call a Guardian, you can Soul Blast 3 and they have to call the card from the top deck over it essentially. This is not once per turn, so you can really take advantage of that if you have enough soul. Obviously this card does not come up as often for me, but this can be an option in the late game too, especially if you accumulated soul and may not have used Minerva, or maybe you've been getting away with the grade 1 Soul Blast Reducer to save your soul. And then of course if you're G guarding, you can amass a good amount of soul where you can use this 4 to 5 times. You can also do this on a restanding turn, so that way your Vanguard can attack twice while also having this powerful effect. And this is a way to deck out an opponent potentially too if they're close to being deck out, and ultimately if they have the resources to stop everything that you have, this can also win you that way. So you can make it so where like if they are guarding stuff, you retire it and then start forcing more cards out of their deck, and then at that point if they get to the point where if they draw they lose, then you win. Or if they draw and then now they can not attack with their Vanguard because of twin drive or triple drive, that's a really good spot for you essentially. So always keep that in mind. And then of course the 1 copy of Ultima, like I mentioned, this card is a powerful win con. It can surprise people because they're not expecting it to as well. The synergy is there with some of the cards, like I said, with like consistency but also restanding, and then also like resist. And then against certain matchups like Mega Colony, this can be another out, especially if you are only able to ride up to your Vanguard and then stride. You can use the Dreaming Dragon stacked with Ultima to restand your Regard still, and still have somewhat of a turn at that point too. So there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to that. And onto the G guards, we are playing 2 copies of Ear. This is your biggest shield, so you can soul charge 2 cards or up to 4 with different grades. So 0, 1, 2, 3 is usually what you do, and it's highly recommended. And it gives you plus 15k shield, so 30k shield. Iris is similar, where you can choose any 3 cards and soul charge it, but it gets plus 5. So it's a medium shield, but it's more flexible on soul charging selectively from your drop. And then you got Laura, which is also a card that can manipulate your drop and your soul by returning 2 to 3 normal units with the same grade. And GB1 flip as well. This is the card that I was talking about. If you Marduk and you do this, you're GB3 for your next turn. This helps prevent deck out a little bit too, because you're returning 3 cards usually with it too. So it's nice to have this, and you get 5k for each card you return. So it's a 30k shield usually. The other card that's really phenomenal is the Minerva. So I hope I pronounced that right. But anyway, this card, essentially, you can put a card from hand or Regalia into soul, and this gets 10k shield. Then, additionally, you can pay another cost where you can add 2 more cards from hand or Regalia into the soul, and then choose one of your opponent's units, and it gets -2 crit for the end of the turn. That is very powerful. And so, well-timed plays is that if you guard a Regalia attack, because it will be a 25k shield, you can minus crit to a different Regalia or the Vanguard itself, and you can start taking Vanguard attacks, especially if they come into a restanding Vanguard. You make it -1 crit. So if they even check a crit, it makes it 0 crit, which you still don't take any damage if they hit at that point. So it makes their Vanguard, if they have a restanding Vanguard, very lackluster with certain clans. Then lastly, we're playing Dismal because you want to protect your Idrissals. You can protect Orphans. You can protect your Norns too as well if they somehow punch your back row. So for this video, I want to take the time to actually show off the possible Ultima turns that you can have too. I think for the rest of the combos like the Minerva, the Marduk plays, you're pretty familiar with. You could also look back at my other prior deck profiles to see the combo plays or the how to play Genesis video as well. But when it comes to the Ultima turn, so let's say you did Marduk the prior turn. So essentially you used 2 counterblasts, 1 for Marduk, 1 for Idrissal. You took some damage, just enough. You're on Angelica. You had given the Norn the second Divine Gauge, so it still has 1, and then you may have used Mikahime. And let's say they might have like got rid of your Idrissal, so that's why your front row's empty at that point too. So as a potential win con, you can pay the cost of Ultimate Stride with a copy with the Vanguard. You also G-guarded, of course, so you're GB3. And then when you ride this, or Ultimate Stride this, I should say, you Counterblast 2. And possible combinations that you can search for are the Idrissal and the Arfin. Sorry for the glare at that point. But essentially, this could be your setup, and then the way that you stack your triggers can be the 2 crits at that point. And if you have like a boost, let's just call it a grade 1, you actually want to call a booster 2. It could be even a trigger that you have in hand, because what happens is that when you drive check, all of your units get that power up too as well. So your booster is going to even get bigger too, so it makes it much more threatening at that point. But this is kind of like the bare minimum that you want to work with. And again, Arfin's protecting all of the Regards over here. So even if they do a Cannoneer player, they have to kill this. Or if they're trying to blister, they can only target this at this point. So when you attack, at this point you can boost thanks to the Idrissal skill. And then you can do your triple drive, which then your crits that you stack apply to each of them. Oh, one important thing. The Force 2 marker. The Force 2 marker. Can't forget about that. And then secondly is the other crit. So your third card can be random. It can be a combo piece. It could be another trigger. If it's another trigger, great. But at that point, you can actually pay the cost, restand, minus the drive check, attack again. So now you have twin drive, and hopefully you get another trigger. In this case, we did not. But as you can see, you have double Vanguard attack. Since you have 2 crit, this is crit 4 at a minimum with this. And you restood again and attacked again. And the power up, essentially, this also gets, this is 25k base. So when you do 25 with 13, this is 38 by itself. 38 plus 10 is 48. And then with the double triggers, that's essentially plus 40 to the column in addition to. So you can see that the numbers add up to like 84 or 83 or something crazy like that. Plus, that's hard to guard, like hard guard. So they have to have a Sentinel at that point. And that doesn't even include like the other cards. So in this case, this is the weakest column. And this is 18 plus 40k, 58 with crit 3. Then attack, 21 plus 40k, 61 with crit 3. So as you can see, these attacks are super lethal, especially while your opponent's at 3. They are super lethal if they're at 4 or more. So if they do heal, they're not going to heal unless they have like 2 heals, 3 heals in a row to survive that turn as well. Now, the other scenario that I wanted to show off is that if you do have a rested field, for example, you can ride your Vanguard right, for example. And it could be Angelica, it could be another Idrisel, but essentially, and let's assume that you do have a Divine Gauge here. So you can actually do, this is against Mega Colony too. So everything's rested and everything like that. So then you Ultimate Strike, you pay the costs over here. So remember, you stack triggers and you do up to 4. So you can do an interesting combination, and I want to share this with you too. So I'm going to purposely pick 4 triggers. You want to get your stand trigger so you can restand your whole rearguard base as well. You won't get a restanding Vanguard in this scenario unless you have a different way of getting a Norn that actually can get a gauge and then of course boosted. So that's the only way, but I'm showing like a minimum play. So this will stand your whole field over your guards essentially. Then your crit will have crit pressure, and then if you know your opponent, like if you're not able to break their hand or something, you can potentially stack 2 heals. So essentially the triple drive will have the 3rd heal, and then you can stack the 4th one to take as a damage. So let's say we do that. Then on attack, there's your stand trigger. Stand, each of these units get +5 as well. Second is a crit. Now all of these get crit and +10k. And the triple drive is heal, and all these get +10k, and you heal 1 at that point too. So then you do your follow turn. So this is like crit 2 with some power-ups. This is crit 2 with some power-ups, right? So that's something. This is assuming you didn't really have anything else to play with. Again, if you didn't have a way to restand this Norn or get a different Norn with the Divine Gauge, you can even go into Minerva and restand. And if you don't have the 6 Regalia to restand the entire Regalia field too, this is another alternative as well. And then when you take the damage, you'll lose your G zone if they live essentially, but you'll take the damage and you can potentially just heal out of it as well, and then also like survive a lot easier for the next turn. And then the next turn, if you have your card still, let's say something like this, you can still do a restanding plays with your grade 3 still. This is basically the premium Regalia at this point too, and you can like maximize from there and go from there. And that's the deck profile, amigos. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you understood like the mindset behind it too. Like Regalia is still a pretty solid deck in the Springfest meta, right before History Collection too. So I definitely encourage you to play test with it, tweak it to your liking as well. Like I mentioned with Frag and the other grade 2 Regalia, it's just that the Counterblast that I feel that holds the deck back a bit too. So that's why I played like Angelica and then a different grade 2 lineup as well. And then it addressed some of the other problems that the deck can run into. That's the biggest thing sometimes with deck building, especially with premium. Not only you're trying to help like your winning image to execute, but at the same time you need cards to like protect you so that winning image can execute you, or at the same time the consistency that you need to see your cards, because Genesis is a clan too that sometimes suffers from consistency. So that's why those are the things you have to have in mind when you're building the deck as well. If you want to support the channel, feel free to use the affiliated links through TCG Player, 50 Card Shop, Trading Card Mint to get your cards next time, and also at a discount. If you also want to book a METAFY session with me one-on-one, feel free to book a session too. And if you're a player that just is hungry and wants to learn more at their pace, you can also pick up my book, How to Win Cardfight Tournaments as well, from Amazon as well. On to the next one, amigos. Bye!